My name is Lawrence Miller. I am 75 years old, a retired public school principal from Scranton, Pennsylvania, and a widower for 6 years now. I live alone in the same two-story brick house where my late wife Geraldine and I raised our daughter, celebrated every birthday and anniversary, and survived the many winters of the northeastern cold. The neighborhood has changed over the decades, once filled with children playing stickball in the streets, now populated mostly by retirees like myself or young families I no longer recognize. But the house has remained a monument to everything I once had and everything I have lost. Each creaking floorboard, every faded photograph in the hallway, and even the chipped edge of the kitchen counter still speak to me in Geraldine's voice. Every morning, without fail, I wake at 6:30, habit mostly. Decades of rising early for school assemblies and faculty meetings, of packing lunch for Geraldine and walking to the corner store before the lines formed. These days, I rise to silence. I put on my robe, make my way to the kitchen, and begin the coffee ritual. Geraldine always made the coffee, even when I offered. "It's not just about the coffee," she used to say, smiling. "It's how the day begins." With care, I try to replicate her method. Medium roast, 2 scoops, a dash of cinnamon. Mine always turns out too bitter or too watery. Still, I drink it. What I never forget, what I cannot forget, is the small gold wedding ring that once rested on Geraldine's finger. I wear it now, not on my hand, but on a silver chain around my neck, tucked under my shirt. I began doing so the day after she passed. We had been married 42 years. There is no replacing that kind of partnership, no substitute for the comfort of a shared past. I suppose some men remarry, take trips, try to recreate what was lost. I never had the urge. What would be the point? It would be like trying to trace over a masterpiece with a crayon. Geraldine was not a woman easily replicated, smart, sharp, and endlessly patient with me even when I was too rigid or too tired. She taught literature at the local high school and could quote Whitman and Dickinson without effort. But she had no tolerance for sentimentality. She believed in honesty above all else, even when it stung. Our daughter Ella was born in 1979, a year of difficult deliveries and inflation. I remember holding Geraldine's hand through the long hours of labor. She never screamed, never cried, just stared straight ahead, jaw set, like she was determined to bring our daughter into the world by sheer will. Ella was a bright child, artistic, intuitive, and often moody. She adored her mother, clung to her skirt when strangers came near, mimicked her handwriting in the margins of her homework, and inherited her stubborn streak wholesale. From me, she got discipline, perhaps too much of it. I was always the parent who said no, the one who enforced curfews, demanded finished homework, insisted on piano lessons when she wanted to quit. I told myself it was for her own good. I still believe that, mostly. Ella grew up fast, too fast. She left for college in Boston and never really came back. She met Benjamin there. Ben, a stocky, clean-cut business student with an easy smile and a careful silence that I never trusted. He rarely looked me in the eye, but Geraldine, ever the optimist, embraced him. "He's good for her," she insisted. "He lets her feel in control." I had my doubts, but I held my tongue. After all, Ella was a grown woman. When they married, I gave a stiff, formal speech at the reception and cried like a child, when no one was watching. Their marriage at first seemed solid. They bought a house in a suburb outside Philadelphia, had no children, not yet, they said, and then later, not ever. Careers came first. Ella worked in real estate, which seemed to suit her. Fast-talking, ambitious, always moving. Ben went into tech consulting. We saw them on major holidays, maybe an occasional summer visit, though less and less after Geraldine became sick. When she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, the world seemed to tilt. Ella visited twice in the first year, once in the second, and then, after her mother entered hospice care, not again. Geraldine never said anything negative about Ella's absence, but I could see it in her eyes. Disappointment, quiet pain, the dulling hope that perhaps our daughter would surprise us, walk through the door one last time. She never did. Geraldine died on a Wednesday in January. It was snowing outside. She was lucid until the final hour, holding my hand and murmuring lines from Crossing the Bar. She asked me to make sure Ella received her sapphire earrings and to never sell the wedding ring. "It's not just jewelry," she said softly. "It's where I put my vows." I promised her I would protect it. After the funeral, sparsely attended thanks to a storm, Ella called, offering vague excuses about canceled flights and meetings she couldn't reschedule. "I'll come up next weekend," she said. She never did. I stopped calling after that. Months passed, then years. Once in a while, she'd send a birthday card, always with her signature alone. No note, no warmth. I tried to understand. I read articles about emotional burnout, about generational gaps, about how adult children navigate guilt. But understanding doesn't ease loneliness. I am her only living parent. But for her, I am a shadow figure, a residual obligation she manages with minimal effort. So I live alone, with Geraldine's books, her faded winter coat still hanging in the hall closet, and that ring on a chain around my neck. I don't travel. I don't attend community dances or potlucks. I read the paper, tend to my small garden, and watch reruns of shows Geraldine liked. I speak to her sometimes, quietly, in the stillness of the kitchen, or at night when the loneliness becomes unbearable. It's not madness, just habit. The habit of being heard. There are days when I feel completely invisible, as if I've outlived my usefulness and exist merely to occupy space. And yet, I endure, out of spite, out of discipline, out of some residual loyalty to the promise I made Geraldine, to live fully until it is time not to. And so each morning I brew coffee. I touch the gold ring on my chest, and I remind myself that memory is a kind of presence, that love, even when unreturned, leaves a trace. I had no way of knowing, of course, that soon Ella would return, not with apologies, not with love, but with desperation, and that the ring on my chest, that small circle of gold that had bound Geraldine and me for over 4 decades, would become the fulcrum of a betrayal so intimate and cutting that it would force me to see my daughter not as a child, but as a stranger. And that would be the beginning, not of reconciliation, but of something far more painful and far more true. It began with a phone call on a Wednesday morning in late October, one of those gray Pennsylvania days where the light never seems to settle and the air feels like it's waiting for snow. I had just returned from the grocery store, a modest trip, some milk, canned soup, apples, instant oats, the usual fare for a man who had stopped cooking real meals years ago. The kitchen window was fogged from the warmth inside meeting the creeping cold beyond the glass, and I had just poured myself a cup of instant coffee when the landline rang. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Hard habit to break. Geraldine always insisted on letting it ring a few times, to give the caller time to think. It was Ella. I recognized her voice instantly, though it sounded different. Not just older. There was something strained beneath the surface, like someone trying to sound cheerful while walking a tightrope. She asked how I was feeling, if I'd seen the foliage this year. Small talk, clumsy and misplaced, like a stranger reciting lines from a script. I answered politely, cautious, but not cold. In truth, I was surprised to hear from her at all. Then came the pause, a deep breath, and the shift. She said things had been difficult lately, that the economy was unpredictable, that Ben's job in tech had taken a hit due to company downsizing, and that their savings had suffered. She mentioned debts, mortgage payments falling behind, credit cards maxed out, and a series of unwise investments that she quickly glossed over. I could feel her circling something, getting closer to a request, but not yet landing. I remained quiet, letting her speak, listening as I always did, even when I knew the end of the sentence would contain a price. And then it came. "Dad, I hate to ask you this," she said, her voice lowering a note, "but do you think you could help us? Just something to tide us over? We're not asking for much, just until things stabilize." I asked her how much. She hesitated, then gave a number, $10,000. I let the silence stretch, not out of cruelty, but because I needed her to feel the weight of what she was asking. This wasn't the first time she had come to me for money. Over the years, there had been little requests disguised as emergencies: a car repair, a deposit on a new apartment, dental work for Ben, even money for a business opportunity that never materialized. I had always said yes, partly out of guilt, partly out of the aching desire to still feel needed by my daughter. But this time felt different. I told her I didn't have $10,000 in liquid savings. It was true. Most of my funds were tied up in fixed retirement accounts, and what little I had in the checking account was reserved for property taxes and winter heating bills. She went quiet, then asked if I had anything valuable. "I don't mean to pressure you," she said, "but it's kind of urgent. Ben's credit is tanking. We might lose the house." I told her I didn't have much that anyone would want. The furniture was old, the car was 15 years past new, and my pension was modest. Another pause, a longer one this time. Then she asked, almost too casually, "What about Mom's ring?" "The wedding ring." "You still have it, right?" The question hit me like a slap. My hand instinctively moved to my chest, to the spot where the chain rested beneath my flannel shirt. I told her yes, of course I still had it. "Well, I mean, I know it's sentimental," she said slowly, "but it's also probably valuable, at least temporarily. You could pawn it, just for a few weeks. I'll pay you back, I swear, with interest. It's just, we're drowning, Dad, and I'm scared." I didn't speak. I stared at the linoleum countertop, tracing the scratches Geraldine used to call battle scars of cooking. I felt like someone had knocked the wind out of me. Of all the things she could have asked for, this was unthinkable. Geraldine's ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was history. It was promise. It was her. "I'm not saying sell it," Ella added quickly, sensing my silence. "Just a pawn, short term. We just need a little leverage, that's all." I said I'd think about it. She thanked me, told me she loved me, and hung up before I could reply. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, unmoving, coffee cooling in my hand. My chest felt heavy, not with sadness, but with a quiet, suffocating disbelief. My daughter had just asked me to give up the one object left in the world that meant something, to treat a symbol of love as a temporary fix for her financial recklessness. That night, I didn't sleep. I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, running through memories like a film reel. The day I proposed to Geraldine in a rainstorm. The night of our anniversary when she slipped the ring off and cleaned it with a toothbrush. The time she lost it in the sink drain, and I spent 3 hours taking apart the pipes to find it. The ring wasn't just metal. It was woven into the fabric of our life. By the next morning, my decision hadn't changed. But I also hadn't called Ella back. I knew I had to. She was my daughter. I couldn't ignore her. I called around 10. She answered on the first ring, as if she had been waiting beside the phone. "I'll let you borrow it," I said slowly, every syllable tasting like ash. "Just for a short while. But you must promise. No pawn shop. You take it to an appraiser, see what it's worth. You don't sell it. You don't give it away. You understand?" She promised. Her voice trembled, almost relieved. "Thank you, Daddy." "You don't know how much this means to us." I asked when she'd come to get it. She said she could be there that afternoon. I told her fine. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table, the phone still warm in my hand, staring at the sunlight catching dust particles in the air. I felt as though I had just committed an act of betrayal, not against Geraldine, but against myself. Ella llegó poco después de las 3. She looked thinner than I remembered, paler, with the kind of brittle energy that comes from too many restless nights and not enough honest conversations. She hugged me stiffly, commented on how the house still smells the same, and asked for tea. I made it silently. She avoided eye contact most of the time, fiddling with her sleeve and making nervous small talk about traffic, renovations, and how expensive things had gotten in Philly. Then I went to the bedroom and opened the top drawer of my bureau. There, in a small velvet box, was the ring. I held it in my palm for a long time before walking back to the living room. Ella saw it, and her eyes widened slightly. She didn't reach for it. She waited for me to offer it. I did, slowly. She took it gently, almost reverently, but I could see her eyes flicker, calculating, distracted. "Just for a few weeks," I reminded her. "Just until things settle." "Of course," she said. "Just a few weeks." She put the ring in her purse, zipped it shut, and stayed for another half-hour, mostly out of obligation. When she left, I watched her car disappear down the street. I felt as though a chapter had closed, but I couldn't tell whether it was one of forgiveness or something far more final. That night, I touched the empty chain around my neck and whispered Geraldine's name aloud. I don't know if I was asking for her forgiveness or her strength. Maybe both. What I did know, without any doubt, was that something had shifted. Something subtle, but seismic. And in the days that followed, that shift would become a fracture. And that fracture would show me a truth I had long refused to see. The first week passed in a strange silence, the kind of silence that sits too heavily to be called peaceful, but too ambiguous to be named dread. I kept waiting for a phone call, some update, some word from Ella to assure me that she had followed my instructions, taken the ring only for appraisal, kept it safe. But no call came. I tried to distract myself, raked the backyard leaves, reorganized the medicine cabinet, even attempted to bake a pie using Geraldine's old recipe, though I ended up burning the crust and setting off the smoke alarm. But none of it worked. Every time I touched the spot beneath my collarbone where the chain used to rest, a dull ache settled in my chest. An ache that felt less like sadness and more like shame. On the 7th day I called her. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I called again the next morning, and again that evening, and once more the day after. No answer, no response. It was as if I had handed her the ring, and in doing so, lost access to whatever fragile line of connection we still had. 3 more days passed. Then finally, she returned my call. Her voice was tight, rushed, mechanical. "Hey, Dad, sorry. I've been swamped. I meant to call. Things are a little crazy right now. We're still figuring things out." I asked her where the ring was. She hesitated for just a beat, but it was enough. "It's safe," she said. "I haven't done anything yet. We're waiting to hear back from a couple of places, appraisers. Some are giving really low-ball estimates, but don't worry, it's fine." Her tone was all wrong. Too light, too fast. It was the voice of someone trying to gloss over a crack in the wall by painting over it with a smile. I asked her directly, had she pawned it? She dodged the question, changed the subject, said she'd call me in a few days when she had a clearer picture. And then she hung up, leaving me staring at the receiver as if it might give me an answer the voice would not. Something inside me hardened. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room under the old lamp Geraldine loved, surrounded by our dusty books and faded wedding photos, staring at the velvet indentation in the jewelry box where the ring used to lie. I tried to believe her, tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, as I always had. But a man who's lived 75 years knows the difference between a pause of thought and a pause of guilt. I decided to find out for myself. The next morning I called an old acquaintance, Stephen Klein, a retired jeweler and fellow widower who sometimes joined me for breakfast at the Veterans Diner on Thursdays. Stephen had always been discreet, a quiet man with eyes like polished granite. I told him the truth, or most of it, that I'd loaned my daughter a piece of jewelry and I wanted to know if it had surfaced locally. He said he hadn't heard anything, but he promised to make a few calls. 2 days later, he called me back. His voice was low. "Lawrence," he said, "I found it." My mouth went dry. He told me it had turned up in a pawn shop in Wilkes Barre, 40 miles south, listed under a batch of estate items. The owner had recognized the design from Stephen's description. It was custom made, a rose gold band with 2 tiny sapphires flanking the central diamond, engraved on the inside with the words, "Still yours." Stephen said the shopkeeper was willing to hold it for a few days, but only if I came in person. That afternoon I drove to Wilkes Barre. It was the first time I'd driven beyond Scranton in almost a year. My hands trembled on the wheel. The shop was tucked between a liquor store and a boarded-up shoe repair shop. The windows dusty, the signage peeling. Inside, the air smelled of old velvet and metal polish. I walked straight to the counter and asked for Henry, the owner. He came out from the back, a balding man in his 60s with eyes like pinch pennies. I gave him my name, and he nodded, then pulled a small case from beneath the counter. He opened it, and there it was, Geraldine's ring. My breath caught in my throat. It looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe the grief had grown larger. I asked when it had come in. He checked his book. 6 days ago, he said. Brought in by a young woman. Brunette. Pale. Looked like she hadn't slept in a week. Didn't say much. I asked what she got for it. He hesitated, then told me. $900. I felt my stomach turn. $900. That's what my daughter had taken for the only thing in the world that still connected me to my wife. I asked what it would take to get it back. He said he couldn't sell it to me directly. It was still under the mandatory holding period, but he could mark it as retrieved by owner if I paid the full amount plus fees. $1,072. I pulled out my checkbook. I didn't even blink. I drove home with the ring on the passenger seat wrapped in tissue. I didn't put it back on the chain. Not yet. I needed time to sit with the fact that my daughter had lied to me, not in the distant adult way of children who keep their lives separate, but directly, deliberately, and for money. Back home, I poured a glass of scotch, sat on the porch, and tried to make sense of it. I wanted to believe that she had done it out of desperation, that some part of her hated herself for it. But then I remembered the ease with which she had spoken, the casual tone, the glib promises. No remorse, no shame. That night I wrote her a letter. Not an email, not a text, a real letter in my own hand. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply told her what I had done, that I had found the ring, that I had bought it back, that I knew she had lied, I asked for no explanation. I told her I didn't need one. I told her that what hurt the most wasn't the act itself, but the silence that followed it, the absence of apology, the quiet confirmation that the bond between us had thinned to the point of breaking. I mailed the letter the next morning and waited. Days passed, then a week. No response, not even an acknowledgement. And slowly, the ache inside me began to curdle into something else. Something colder, heavier, harder to name. Not hatred, not yet, but the beginning of a reckoning. And I knew then, with the terrible clarity that only betrayal can bring, that this wasn't about a ring. It was about everything that had led us here, all the choices made, the silences kept, the debts unpaid, not in dollars, but in love withheld and loyalty abandoned. I had lost my daughter, perhaps years ago, but now I could no longer deny it, and that more than anything was what would keep me awake for the nights to come. 2 weeks passed without a single word from Ella. The letter I sent remained unanswered, as though I had addressed it to a ghost, and each day of silence felt more deliberate, more like a decision than an oversight. I tried to convince myself that maybe she was ashamed, that perhaps she didn't know what to say. But as the days grew colder and the sun slipped away sooner, a more troubling thought began to settle over me, like frost on a windshield. Maybe she didn't care. Maybe shame had never entered the equation. I stopped calling. I stopped waiting. Instead, I went about my days with mechanical discipline. Morning coffee, the newspaper, a walk around the block, dinner alone in front of the television. But everything I did was now underscored by the heaviness of that betrayal. The ring sat in its box on my nightstand, untouched, too sacred to wear again and too painful to hide away. I couldn't look at it without hearing Geraldine's voice echoing in my head, reminding me of what it had meant. Still yours. That inscription had once brought me comfort. Now it stung like a wound. Then, out of nowhere, on a Thursday afternoon, I heard a knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Most people called before visiting, those who still remembered I existed at least. I opened the door to find Ella standing there, wrapped in a long beige coat, her hair tied back, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. She looked thinner, her face drawn in a way that made her seem older than she was. She smiled, but it was forced, brittle, a mask stretched too tightly across something raw. Before I could speak, she stepped inside without invitation and took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were red. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, setting her purse on the console table in the hallway. "I didn't know how to answer your letter. I didn't want to lie again." I didn't respond right away. I just stood there, watching her as if I were seeing her for the first time. She glanced around the house as if expecting it to look different, to carry some sign of how much damage her absence had done. She sat down on the sofa, folded her hands in her lap, and stared at the floor. "I know what I did was wrong," she said. "I know I betrayed your trust. I didn't come here to make excuses, but things were bad, Dad. Really bad. Ben and I were fighting constantly. We're not together anymore." I blinked. "You and Ben separated?" 3 weeks ago. He kicked me out, said I was reckless, that I had crossed too many lines. He found out about the ring. I didn't tell him. He saw the pawn shop receipt in my drawer. "So he didn't know?" She shook her head. "He knew we were in trouble financially, but not how deep. I kept taking out loans behind his back, using one credit card to pay off another. I kept thinking I could fix it before it all came crashing down. But I couldn't. And when he found out, he said he didn't recognize me anymore." I sat in the armchair opposite her. I felt no satisfaction, no vindication, just the quiet confirmation of something I had already suspected. The ring wasn't the root of her undoing, only the symbol of it. The culmination. She was unraveling long before she took it, and now she was sitting in front of me, with her life in shambles and no one left to lie to. "Why didn't you just tell me?" I asked. "Why not come to me with the truth?" "Because I was ashamed," she said, looking up at me finally. "Because I didn't want you to see me like that. I didn't want to be your failure." I almost laughed at the irony of it. "And instead, you made yourself my thief." She flinched, but didn't deny it. I know what I did, and I'll never forgive myself for it." We sat in silence for a long time. The kind of silence that only comes between family members who've wounded each other deeply, but still hope, in some corner of their hearts, that something might be salvageable. She looked older than I remembered, not just in the lines of her face, but in the heaviness of her posture, as though she'd finally been forced to carry the weight of her choices. "I'm not here to ask for money," she said at last. "I'm not even asking for forgiveness. I don't know where else to go. I don't have a place to stay. I've been in a motel for a week, but I can't afford it anymore. I thought maybe, just for a few days." I stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman sitting in front of me with the child I once read bedtime stories to, the teenager I once grounded for skipping school, the bride I once toasted with trembling hands. I thought about Geraldine and what she would say if she were still alive. Would she tell me to let her in, to help her find her feet? Or would she say, "Enough, Lawrence. She's made her choices"? I didn't know. "All right," I said finally. "You can stay, but just for a few days." She nodded quickly, almost too quickly, as if afraid I'd change my mind. "Thank you," she whispered. "I promise I won't be a burden." I got up and walked upstairs to prepare the guest room. As I stripped the bed and laid out fresh towels, a knot of unease settled in my chest. I wasn't sure whether I was doing the right thing, or merely repeating the same old pattern of rescuing, of hoping, of being hurt again. But part of me, however small, still wanted to believe that people could change, even when they had shown you every reason to believe otherwise. What I didn't know, what I couldn't know, was that letting her back into my house was not the beginning of healing, but the final test of everything I thought I understood about love, loyalty, and the fragile, shifting lines between forgiveness and foolishness. Ella moved into the guest room as if it had always been hers, carrying only a single suitcase and a crumpled canvas tote bag that looked ready to split at the seams. She didn't ask for help unpacking, and I didn't offer. We both moved around each other like ghosts in a house full of unspoken things, careful not to make too much noise, too much eye contact, or too many questions. For the first 2 days, she kept to herself. She slept late, emerged from her room with red-rimmed eyes, made coffee that was far too strong, and scrolled endlessly through her phone as if searching for a version of her life that still made sense. I let her be. I cooked simple meals, grilled cheese, baked potatoes, canned soup, and she ate them without comment. At night, I heard her walking the hallway long after I had gone to bed, as though sleep itself had become a stranger. On the third morning, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, dressed, alert, and typing furiously on her laptop. She looked up, her expression bright, rehearsed. "I've been reaching out to a few firms," she said. "Real estate groups, small ones. Nothing big. Just trying to see what's out there." I nodded and poured myself coffee. She kept talking, filling the room with the hopeful rhythm of someone trying to rebuild a broken bridge with her voice alone. She mentioned a contact in Baltimore, a possible lead in Albany, and a vague promise of remote work doing real estate consulting. "It's all still very tentative," she said, "but at least I'm trying." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something in her tone, in the way she gripped her coffee cup too tightly or glanced at her phone mid-sentence, felt familiar in the worst way, like the smoothness of a lie being polished in real time. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to break the fragile illusion that maybe, just maybe, she was climbing out of the hole she had dug herself into. But that night, I checked my medicine cabinet and noticed 2 bottles of prescription pills, my cholesterol medication and a low-dose sleep aid, had been moved. I never told her where I kept them. The caps were tight. Nothing was missing, but I knew I hadn't touched them in days. The next morning, I checked my bank records. I hadn't shared any access to my accounts, hadn't written any checks recently, hadn't logged into online banking since she arrived. Everything seemed in order. But the next day, the mail came, and in it was a letter from the credit union, where I kept a small secondary savings account. One I had nearly forgotten about. One I hadn't used in years, but still held a few $1,000s in case of emergencies. The letter informed me that someone had inquired about adding a secondary account holder to the account and had been denied due to missing identification. My name was printed clearly at the top of the form, but the handwriting on the signature line wasn't mine. It was Ella's. She hadn't even bothered to disguise it. I waited until dinner to bring it up. I made spaghetti the way Geraldine used to, with too much oregano and a pinch of sugar in the sauce. We ate mostly in silence until I pushed the letter across the table. She didn't even blink when she saw it. "I was just trying to help," she said. "I thought maybe I could consolidate things for you, make it easier to manage." I stared at her, the fork in my hand frozen halfway to my mouth. "Without telling me?" I asked. "Without asking." She shrugged. "I knew you'd say no." Her voice was calm, reasonable, like she was explaining the weather. "But you're getting older, Dad. Your memory's not what it used to be. You forgot to lock the back door twice this week. You left the stove on after breakfast on Tuesday." I opened my mouth to protest, but stopped. I had forgotten the back door once. I had left the stove on for maybe a minute before turning it off. Minor things, normal for someone my age, perhaps, but now they were being used as evidence. She continued, "I'm just worried about you. What if something happens? What if you fall and can't reach the phone? You need someone to help manage things, and I'm here." I felt my heart hammering in my chest, not out of fear, but fury. Quiet, patient fury that had taken weeks to bloom. I realized then that she hadn't come back because she missed me, or even because she had nowhere to go. She came back because she had seen what she thought was an opportunity. A lonely, aging father, vulnerable and sentimental, whose assets could be massaged, consolidated, and quietly transferred. The next day I visited the bank in person. I asked to restrict all accounts, add additional verification procedures, and remove any notes of attempted access. I didn't tell Ella. I began keeping the ring in my jacket pocket instead of the nightstand, and I locked the door to my study where my documents and personal files were kept. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked the house in silence, checking the locks, unplugging the toaster, counting my medications. I felt like a man living with a stranger, not my daughter, but someone wearing her face. A few days later, I came home from a morning walk to find Ella in my study. The door had been pried open, the old brass lock splintered. She was sitting at my desk, a folder of documents in front of her, and she didn't even look startled. "We need to talk," she said. "I found the deed to the house. You never added me to it. Why?" My mouth went dry. I told her this was my home, that I'd always planned to leave it to her in the will, but there was no reason to make it joint property while I was still alive. "But what if something happens to you?" she said. "What if you get sick, or worse? Probate is hell. You know that. It'll take months. This way we avoid all of that. It's practical." I told her no. She stared at me, then stood up slowly, gathering the documents. "Fine," she said. "Then I guess we'll have to do it another way." That night I searched her room while she was in the shower. I found a file in her tote bag with copies of legal forms, durable power of attorney, health proxy assignments, financial management agreements, all half filled with my name. Some had forged signatures. She had even listed my primary care doctor's name on one of them. I took photos. I put everything back exactly as it was. Then I called my lawyer. Martin Halverson had handled my affairs since Geraldine passed. I met him at his office the next day. A quiet room above a dentist's office with large leather chairs and an air of perpetual caution. I showed him the photos, told him everything about the ring, the bank inquiries, the forged forms, the sudden attentiveness. He listened quietly, then leaned back and exhaled. "You're not the first," he said, "and you won't be the last. Financial elder abuse is real, and it's often done by family. But you've acted wisely. You've documented. You've been cautious." He advised me to update my will, remove Ella as primary heir, and set up a trust with specific disbursement conditions. He also helped me draft a revocable living trust assigning my medical and financial decisions to a third party, a retired judge and distant cousin named Walter, whom I barely knew, but who had a reputation for being incorruptible. We filed the paperwork that afternoon. Martin told me gently that if Ella persisted, I could take further legal action, even obtain a protective order. I nodded, but the idea of dragging my own daughter into court turned my stomach. When I returned home that evening, Ella was gone. Her room was empty. A note on the kitchen table read, "You've made your choice. So have I." That night, I checked my credit report online. There were 3 inquiries from loan companies I'd never contacted, 2 attempts at opening new lines of credit, all within the last 10 days. I spent hours on the phone freezing my credit, contacting banks, alerting the fraud department. I sat at my desk past midnight, staring at the darkness outside the window, realizing that this slow erosion of trust, of identity, of name and number and will, was not an accident. It was a strategy. And I had nearly fallen for it again. I didn't hear from her for weeks. Then one afternoon, a police officer showed up at my door with a clipboard, a wellness check. "Your daughter called," he said. "Said she was worried, claimed you might be having memory issues." I stared at him in disbelief. I invited him in, showed him my prescriptions, my legal files, my bank logs. We chatted about local politics and the Phillies' miserable season. After half an hour, he apologized and left. But I knew now that this wasn't over. Ella was building something, quietly, piece by piece. A case, an image, a story in which I was no longer the man I knew myself to be. And if I didn't act decisively, if I hesitated even once more, I would wake one morning to find my name removed from everything I owned. 3 days after the wellness check, I received an envelope by certified mail, thick and formal with the unmistakable weight of legal intent. The return address belonged to a law firm in Philadelphia, Branham and Coyle. Inside was a neatly typed letter addressed to me as Mr. Lawrence H. Miller, which outlined, in calm and confident language, my daughter's concern for my diminishing cognitive faculties, her sincere desire to ensure the security of my person and estate, and her petition to the court to have herself appointed as my legal guardian on the basis of evidence gathered over several weeks of cohabitation. I read it once, then again, then a third time, until the words blurred into each other and became just white noise pounding in my ears. So this was it, the real plan at last. Not a spontaneous act of desperation, but a long, careful campaign, an erasure disguised as protection, a power grab camouflaged in filial concern. The letter included a date for a preliminary hearing 2 weeks away and advised that I would be contacted by a court-appointed evaluator prior to that time. I folded the letter slowly, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on the table without a word. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I sat there in silence, listening to the distant hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, and the faint ache rising in my chest like a slow tide. For years, I had clung to the hope that there was still a part of Ella that remembered love. True love, not the transactional performance she adopted whenever she needed something. But this letter was the final blow, the quiet document that severed all illusions. It was not just a betrayal of trust, it was a betrayal of memory itself. The next morning I called Martin. He answered on the second ring. I read him the letter, and he didn't sound surprised. "We'll respond," he said calmly, "and we'll request a court-ordered medical evaluation on our terms. I'll handle the filings. In the meantime, I need you to stay sharp, stay safe, and stay visible. No isolation, no missed appointments, no room for misinterpretation." I assured him that I understood. That afternoon, I made 3 appointments: my primary physician, a neurologist, and a geriatric psychologist. I underwent every test they offered: cognitive function, memory recall, motor skills, verbal reasoning. I passed all of them. My reflexes were a little slower, my handwriting not as crisp, but my mind was still mine. The doctors provided written statements. Martin compiled the evidence. We drafted our own statement of defense and counterfiled to have the petition dismissed. A week later, I was visited by the court-appointed evaluator, a young woman named Helen, no older than 30, wearing a navy pantsuit and carrying a clipboard. She was polite, efficient, and deeply skeptical. We spent nearly 2 hours together. She asked about my daily routine, my finances, my relationships, my memory of recent events. I answered calmly, deliberately, never once faltering. I showed her the ring, told her its story, explained the bank inquiries and the attempted account modifications. I gave her copies of the forms Ella had filled out in my name, pointed to the handwriting. I showed her the letter from Branham and Coyle. Helen nodded and scribbled notes but gave nothing away. When she left, I walked her to the door and offered her a slice of the apple pie I'd baked that morning. She declined, but smiled faintly before she left. "You seem very capable, Mr. Miller," she said. "I'll file my report by the end of the week." 4 days later, Martin called. His voice was triumphant. "The report's in. The court has rejected the guardianship petition. Helen concluded, you are mentally competent, financially independent, and emotionally sound." Her exact words. I felt my knees weaken and had to sit. "It's over?" I asked. "This part," he said. "But don't expect it to be the end of everything. She'll push back. Maybe appeal. Maybe try something else. But now the court has a record of her actions. And you have leverage. Real leverage." I didn't sleep much that night. I sat by the bedroom window, the velvet box with the ring resting in my palm, and I watched the moon shift slowly across the sky. I thought about Geraldine, about the quiet way she used to argue, about the way she would have seen all of this, coldly, clearly, but not without pain. She had always said, "Love doesn't mean blindness." And now, finally, I saw everything for what it was. The next day I drove to the county office and filed the paperwork to change the deed of the house, transferring ownership into an irrevocable trust outside Ella's reach, with Walter named as trustee. Then I called the moving company and arranged to vacate the house within the month. I found a modest apartment in a retirement community on the other side of town. Quiet, clean, filled with people who played cards in the afternoons and talked about nothing more urgent than the weather and medications. It was the opposite of ambition, of manipulation, of conflict. And it felt like peace. I changed my phone number. I opened a new post office box. I updated my bank details and notified only Martin and the retirement community of my new address. The final step was writing one last letter to Ella. I didn't want confrontation. I didn't want a scene. I wanted the truth, written plainly, once and for all. I told her that I knew everything. That I had seen the forms, read the filings, spoken to the banks. I told her that the ring had come back to me, not because she gave it back, but because I took it back. I told her that the guardianship attempt had failed, that I was of sound mind, and that the court agreed. And then I told her, gently but without apology, that she was no longer a part of my life, that I wished her peace and healing, but that the door to this house and to my trust was closed permanently. I signed the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and dropped it in the mailbox on the way to my new apartment. As the sun dipped behind the trees and the shadows stretched long across the road, I felt not triumphant, but empty, like someone who had finally finished digging a grave and was only just realizing it had been for something he once loved. The retirement community turned out to be quieter than I'd imagined. Not lifeless, as I had feared, but steady, unpretentious, and oddly kind. The halls smelled of linen and weak coffee, and the windows faced the eastern sky. So I learned to wake not by alarm, but by the warmth of morning light creeping over the low trees. My neighbors were mostly widows and veterans, people with long memories and quiet routines, who spoke softly and listened slowly. No one asked intrusive questions. Everyone minded their own grief. In that silence, I began to breathe again. I decorated the new apartment with photographs of Geraldine, framed copies of poems she'd loved, and the quilt she'd made during her final year, the one with crooked seams and colors that didn't match, but still warmed better than anything store-bought. I hung the ring above my desk, not around my neck, not hidden away, but in a shadow box under glass, with the word "Still Yours" etched on a small brass plate beneath it. It was no longer a wound to carry or a secret to guard. It was a truth I had endured and reclaimed. I began attending Thursday chess nights at the common room. I walked the courtyard after dinner and watered the violets on my window ledge. I spoke to Geraldine sometimes, quietly, not out of madness, but because love leaves a habit of speaking. I didn't mention Ella, not even in thought, not at first. I allowed myself, instead, to build a rhythm without her shadow, without the silence of her betrayal, without the weight of always wondering if this would be the moment she called with another need, another story, another carefully rehearsed crisis. And in that rhythm, I began to feel something close to peace. Not joy. Joy belongs to a younger kind of man. But stillness. Stillness is a kind of grace. Months passed. I received no letters, no calls. My new number remained untouched by her voice. I heard through Martin that she had left Philadelphia, that she was living somewhere down south, maybe Georgia or the Carolinas, still working in real estate, but under a different name. There were whispers of bankruptcy, of a failed arbitration with Ben, but I asked no details. I didn't need them. I had no desire for vengeance, only distance. And distance was finally mine. One afternoon in late March, I visited the local animal shelter. I hadn't planned to adopt anything. I told myself I was only there to look. But in the far corner of the kennels, I found an old beagle mix with cloudy eyes and a limp in his left leg. He looked at me without begging, without hope, just the calm gaze of a creature that had stopped expecting rescue. I adopted him on the spot. I named him Barley, after Geraldine's favorite breakfast cereal, and he followed me home without a sound. We became old men together. In his silence, I found companionship. In his trust, I found a kind of healing. He never asked for more than food, warmth, and a lap when the thunder came. He never lied to me. In early May, I rewrote my will. I removed Ella's name from every line. Not in anger, but in clarity. I left most of my estate to a women's shelter Geraldine used to volunteer with, an organization that helped mothers rebuild their lives after abuse, addiction, or loss. I included a letter to the shelter explaining my decision and asked that the donation be made anonymously, but that Geraldine's name appear on a plaque if they insisted on having one. I didn't want a legacy. I wanted to return to something that had once felt good and clean and real. I left a small portion for Barley's care, should he outlive me, and another sum to Walter, who never asked for thanks. I signed the documents, sealed them, and placed them in Martin's hands with a quiet nod. Nothing dramatic, just a door closing without noise. And yet, late at night, there are moments, brief and infrequent, when I wonder if she ever thinks of me, if she regrets anything, if she dreams of the house she tried to make hers, or the ring she once betrayed for less than a month's rent. I wonder if she remembers her mother's laugh, the smell of our garden, the time we built a snow fort together that collapsed before we finished it. I allow myself the wondering. I do not allow the ache. The ache I buried with the old house, with the mailbox I no longer open, with the version of Ella I once believed in. Now I live day to day. I water the plants, I walk the dog, I play quiet games of chess with strangers who no longer need to ask my story. And sometimes, when I touch the glass of the shadow box and whisper her name, not in anger, but as one speaks of a grave, I feel something move inside me. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but finality. And finality is its own kind of freedom.